The book that I'm going to be talking about, and my thesis, in fact, is The Gendered Brain. And that is how our brains get to be different. And in fact, when I started this journey to the book, I was interested very much because, as was mentioned, I am an autism researcher. And there's a great saying in the autism community that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So having spent many years looking at a huge range of different sorts of brains, different sorts of behaviors, I really wanted to focus on the question, how do brains get to be different? Are they born different? Are they made different? Is what goes on outside the brain completely irrelevant to how our brains develop and the end point that they reach? And so I thought, well, the clearest difference that everybody agrees about is that male brains are different from female brains. That's a very clear difference. We've been searching it for many years, and this would be a good way of really getting a handle on why brains are different. And actually, what I then found was that, to my surprise, and actually to the disagreement with quite a lot of people, who I will be talking about later, I found that the research did not really support the idea that men's brains were different from women's brains, which to many people is a big surprise. And to many people say that clearly I have got this wrong, because of course men's brains are different from women's brains. So really tonight I'm going to share with you the journey where I look back and said, where has this idea come from? What is 21st century neuroscience, the kind of work that I'm doing, got to tell us about this difference, and why might we think about it differently? So the title is The Gendered Brain, and it's how the world changes your brain and makes up your mind. Because I really believe, as we shall see, that a gendered world makes a gendered brain. So just briefly to say to you, to present my credentials, I work at Aston Brain Centre, as was mentioned, and I have, see if I can find the right way, oh, it's this one. Okay, so we have access to all of the brain imaging techniques with which people are familiar. So fMRI on the far side, old-fashioned form, EEG, if I can show the right. You can see that up there, yes. With obviously a very old picture of me with a very small daughter discovering the problems, the perils of having a mother as a neuroscientist. But she seemed to survive. And we also have other ways of looking at the brain. So these are the kind of images I spend my days looking at. And they do seem to show that there are all sorts of very marked differences between different sorts of brains. And what I wanted to know was, did those differences come from people being male or female? So what we really need to, I think I might have lost a slide here, but I'll talk briefly about how female brains get to be different from male brains. This was very much the story that evolved, and that suggested that there were two sorts of brains. We were born with different brains, and that's something we'll probably come back to. And this little brain here, this little boy brain, followed this kind of trajectory. It was born perhaps with some of the skills that were going to be necessary to make it a hugely successful individual, powerful, might win the Nobel Prize, write a best-selling book, whatever level of achievement and power and influence was necessary. So the brain got a bit bigger, acquired more of these necessary skills, gradually came to a developmental endpoint, which was a brain that was fixed to be successful, to have particular kinds of skills. The other sort of brain, which I've cheekily coloured pink, is actually to do with the fact that maybe these little brains, these little female brains, weren't born with the same kind of skills because they weren't going to need them. And then what we found was that the brain gets bigger. Certainly if I was talking to you in the 19th century, I would be saying, we have to protect these little brains. We shouldn't expose them to the dangers of higher education because they would probably damage the brains. So gradually the brain got bigger, and then it arrived at a particular, so I'm going too fast here, arrived at a particular endpoint where, again, cheekily, I've coloured it as it liked dressing up in pink and being princessy, very emotionally labile, but good at understanding emotions. So we had a very clear idea that there were two different types of brains, a male brain and a female brain. And this was very much supported, as we shall see, even up to and including the 21st century scientists, because that's actually how they started looking at this particular debate. They said, clearly men's brains are different from women's brains. We will use all the new techniques that arrive in order to continue hunting for this difference. So you get books, for example, a book called The Essential Difference. And essential is an interesting word, and it would be really interesting to talk to people later about how well that translates into Spanish. Essential in this case means some kind of biological characteristic. So the essential difference meant that women and men were biologically different, and therefore the difference between their brains was essential. But another meaning of the word essential is that this is really, really important, and that something we must have. It is really important. And an element of that, in the beginning, I would say that the beginning of this book, and I will come back to it, opening lines, the female brain, so clearly that is a thing, is hardwired. So the idea is that we've got some kind of fixed, biologically created characteristic for empathy. So immediately we have linked the fact that there is a particular kind of brain with a particular kind of behavior. Next line, the male brain is hardwired for understanding systems. So again, different kind of brain which has a particular kind of skill, and the downstream consequences we will come to. Now there seems to be, and it is interesting, I find, particularly in terms of some of the reactions I've got to the book that I've written, people really need to believe that there are differences between males and female brains. And whenever, as a neuroscientist, if I see in a neuroscience journal a tiny whiff of a sex difference in a brain found somewhere, sooner or later it will appear in the popular press with usually headlines saying, "At last the truth," or "Proof at last," almost as though, I'll come back to those ones later, actually I'll skip that one. The idea being that, this is really important, and at last those scientists have caught up with what we knew all along, that men's and women's brains were different. The other aspect of the world, or beliefs about brains, have been fed by these kind of books. Men are from Mars and Women are from Venus, which you may well be familiar with, hugely best-selling at the end of the last century, and people still continue to refer to it, if not necessarily that book, but the idea that men and women are so different, they could almost come from different planets. And clearly, and this was one of the early books that sort of hijacked the new kind of neuroscience findings that were coming out at that time, clearly that difference arose from the fact that they had different brains. So these sort of self-help books adapted these neuroscience, and I have to say, I'm not very polite about these kind of books. So we will see that this kind of book, which is written by a genuine sort of neuroscientist and has some credibility as far as I'm concerned, but still is very much entrenched in the hunt the difference. We get all of these, at last the truth, whereas I'm afraid I dismiss these kind of books as neurotrash, because the authors were very keen on these wonderful images that we could produce, rather less keen on describing how complicated it was to produce them and what they really meant. But what they did was use them to illustrate this amazing fact that they wanted to sell to everybody, that men and women were very different. So this is, if you like, the chain of argument. This is really what we're talking about still today. This is the kind of chain of argument that was around at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, when the idea that the brain was really important. And this was that whatever it was that made men and women different, and obviously right early on in history, they didn't have access to understanding genetics, for example, whatever it was that made men and women anatomically different also made their brains different. So if you had a female anatomy, you had a female brain. If you had a male anatomy, you had a male brain. And that was a direct link, inevitable, fixed, unchangeable. The consequence of having that kind of brain was that you had a particular kind of psychological profile, particular kind of personality, particular kind of temperament. So if you had a female brain, you were very good at empathy type stuff, very good at understanding emotions, but rubbish at reading maps. You know, never have a woman as a navigator, quote. Whereas if you had a male brain, male brains were very good at spatial tasks, very good at all kinds of spatial manipulation, which we'll come back to later, but rubbish at listening, rubbish at understanding emotions, didn't want to know. And there's all sorts of other ways of describing male and female brains. Male brains are like waffles, neatly divided into little squares where they kept all the information separately, whereas women's brains are more like spaghetti and everything's all muddled up together. And the consequence of those different kinds of brains and skills was that males and females had different roles in society. So that women who were good at empathy would make the most wonderful nurses, carers, primary school teachers, etc. Whereas men with these wonderful spatial skills would be very good at being scientists or explorers. So there we have Einstein and Christopher Columbus, in fact. So this was a very clear idea. But of course, what's happening here is that the scientists at that time were working backwards from the status quo. They looked at their society. They said, in fact, absolutely, they said this quite clearly, it's published, women are inferior to men, so we need to explain what makes their brains inferior. So this Hunt the Difference agenda wasn't a kind of value-free crusade. It was, we need to explain what we see in society. So although this chain of argument goes in this direction, historically, people were working backwards and looking to find the answer to a question that they had set themselves. Okay, so just in order to illustrate perhaps the kind of political content of this, a reminder that this is something that emerged at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. So, so-called objective scientists, and I have to say, apologies, they were all men, had very particular views about some of the people they were studying, i.e. women. So we have Le Bon, women represent the most inferior forms of human evolution and are closer to children and savages than to an adult civilized man. And then, in fact, even not that long ago, we must start with the realization that as much as women want to be good scientists or engineers, they want first and foremost to be womanly companions of men and to be good mothers. So these were the male scientists, this was their particular view of what they were trying to explain. And we came up with all of these wonderful different ways of looking at the brain, because remember at this time we didn't have access to intact living human brains with intact living humans solving problems. We looked at people who had diseased brains or dead or damaged brains, or we looked at brains from people after they were dead. So there was a lot of theorizing about brains before we could even actually see them. And so you've got people weighing, taking empty skulls, filling them with birdseed or buckshot, and then weighing that and saying, you know, who's got the bigger brain? So as ever in this kind of debate, size matters became a very important issue. So they discovered to their delight that on average, and we'll come back to that, men's brains were about 5 ounces heavier than women's. So the solution at last, bigger the brain, the better. That's why men were superior, champions, why the human race has succeeded. And then a spoilsport said, well, actually having a bigger brain, if you're equating that with being intelligent, then sperm whales and elephants should actually be more intelligent than human males. And generally, that's not a characteristic we attribute to sperm whales and elephants. So then we came up with all sorts of other different ways. Maybe it was the ratio of the brain size to the body size, all sorts of phrenology, feeling bumps on the head to try and understand the characteristics of the owner of that brain, measuring the skull in all sorts of different ways, really to try and guess what the brain was like that was contained within that skull. Very elaborate metrics were introduced. What made those metrics successful? How did somebody know that that was the best way of looking at the brain? Again, we see that this was not a value-free origin of this particular crusade. The best metrics were the ones which meant that white, because it did intersect with race issues, men, upper class, educated, they had to be at the top of any scale that was produced. Further down came women and children, quite a lot further down. After that came the lower classes, and after that came other races. So this metric, the way in which you measure this difference, right from the beginning, did have a kind of political connotation. Now, I'm obviously not saying that that's what's going on today, but when we look at some of the data that's coming out later, which is still very much a continuation of this hunt the difference agenda, I think that's something we need to bear in mind. Okay, so fast forward to the 21st century. You saw some of the techniques that I have in my lab. We have access to these wonderful techniques. We can give people all sorts of tasks. We can get them lying in our scanners. We can ask them questions. We can get them to watch videos. We can get them to think about things. We can even have different people in different scanners and all sorts of conversations going on, etc. So the big question would be, you'd think right from the beginning, if we think male brains are different from female brains, surely what we need to establish first of all, that there are differences between men's and women's brains. Are there any? People are quite surprised with the answer. When I say quite firmly, actually no. Now that is not to say that there are not sort of minute sex differences in the brain which are relevant to some of the hormone activities that we'll come back to later. And in fact, that if you took a big group of men and a big group of women and measured particular characteristics of their brain, you might come up with one particular part of the brain which was bigger in most men than in most women, or another part of the brain which was bigger in most women than most men. But there is no clear-cut difference between the brains of men and the brains of women that people like me, neuroscientists, after pretty nearly 50 years of measuring, have come up with. And the people find that quite surprising. You couldn't give me, or anybody, a brain and say, is that the brain from a man or a brain from a woman? It's not like police procedural TV programs where, somebody picks up a bone and says, ooh, that's from a 34-year-old woman who's had 3 children and likes gin, for example. We can't understand brains of that. But this is surprising. People say, well, look at the research. Decades of research have shown. And you get papers like this, Sex Differences in the Adult Human Brain. There are thousands of papers published every year which have sex differences in the human brain. And they list a particular kind of characteristics, structures where they found differences. But then somebody else will come along, not very much later, and say, do you know, we've reviewed all the literature which is associated with this particular difference. And actually, we haven't found any difference. So, first lot of paper, we found differences, male-female differences in structure X, next, and also structure Y. Another set of papers said, well, we didn't find anything in X and Y, but actually we did find something in Z. So what's happening is that we look at the research data. A journalist might come along and says, I haven't got time to look at all of these papers. Neuroscientists haven't got time to look at all of these papers, so journalists certainly won't. And says, well, yes, well, thousands and thousands of papers have reported sex differences, so there must be sex differences. But the answer is that we haven't as yet come up with any consistent way of reliably distinguishing the brains from men from the brains from women. And you also find that scientists themselves, and time for a bit of confession, scientists themselves sometimes overhype their findings. So because of the way in which research currently works and research publication currently works, generally you will set up a study which is looking for a difference, and because this hunt the difference agenda continues, I hypothesize there will be a difference in this structure between males and females. If you find it, you publish it. If you don't find it, you think, I must have got that wrong, so I won't publish that. So, of course, what you then see is, this is why I call it the iceberg problem, because lurking in the apparently empty waters here are probably many, many more findings where people set out to find a difference and didn't find one. So they didn't publish it. They didn't send it for review. Or the reviewers said there must be something wrong with this because clearly there are differences between males and females. And if you haven't found it, there's something wrong with your research. Go away and do it again. But anyway, it won't get published. But scientists, therefore, will really emphasize where they do find differences. And this is a paper which became quite notorious for really illustrating this. And if the publishers are worried that I might get you sued for slander, this is a very publicly debated problem. So the initial findings were reported in very, very powerful pathways. This was looking at pathways in the brain and not structures, and that is a new way of looking now, not just looking at little bits of the brain, but how they're connected. Big, powerful difference between male and female brains. These were illustrated by clear-cut, nice, thick blue pathways showing that male brains were much better connected from front to back, whereas female brains, illustrated with orange here, were much better connected right to left or the other way around. So this was described again, sex differences in the structural connectome of the human brain. But what the authors didn't say was these were something like 134 comparisons that they did where they found a significance. I'll come back to that. Out of something like 134,000 comparisons. So there were lots and lots of comparisons made. The only ones they focused on were the ones where they found a difference. That's not necessarily, I'm not talking about any kind of fraud, but it just means that you're getting a kind of different picture for how different these brains really are. But the other important thing to remember in this particular graph here, if you take any one image away from this evening, it's that these are the kind of differences we're talking about. If you take data from men, data from women on any task, or perhaps any brain measure, you will get overlapping distributions like this. So big variability within the two groups, which are supposedly biologically homogeneous if you're only asking what sex they are, but tiny differences between them. If you've got a big data set, statistically that might be significant, but actually it's pretty meaningless. It means knowing that somebody's a male or somebody's a female is not going to tell you what their brain is going to be like or how they're going to perform on a particular task. You're talking about average differences, and I think that's quite an important message to remember. But the reason I put this here with this paper is those were the biggest differences, the most striking differences they found between these pathways, which I think you'll agree are pretty tiny. And yet they describe these as fundamental sex differences. And of course, as you can imagine, lots and lots of headings, at last the truth, proof at last. So scientists themselves are kind of contributing to this. Right, moving on. So it looks as though we've come to an endpoint, but there are gender gaps in the world, and this is why people find it quite hard to say, why are you saying men's brains aren't different from women's brains? And I'll come back to that at the end. But we do need to remember that this is where the story started, looking at society. What do women do? What do men do? How do women perform on certain tasks? How do men perform on certain tasks? So there are some kind of differences, but we've looked inside the brain and we can't find any in particular. Maybe we should be looking outside the brain at the kind of changes that what's going on outside the brain might in themselves be reflected inside the brain. So it's a rewrite of the old, what I call passed its sell by, nature or nurture argument. What neuroscience has found in the 21st century is that actually nature and nurture are so entangled that we shouldn't be trying to separate them. And there's two particular characteristics that we need to bear in mind. First of all, that our brains are plastic, and secondly, that our brains are permeable. What do we mean by plastic? Not kind of cheap and nasty and easily breakable. What we mean is plastic in terms of moldable, flexible, changeable, responsive to whatever's going on in the outside world. Now, if you remember the chain of the essentialist pathway that I showed you before, the idea was that each brain ends at a particular endpoint, a fixed endpoint. And that endpoint, it was believed until about the last 30 years, was pretty much fixed by the time you're in your late teens, early 20s. Your brain developed along a fixed pathway that must be acknowledged as a kind of biological contribution. But the brain you arrived at that particular endpoint was pretty much the brain you was going to have for the rest of your life and was going to carry you through the rest of your life. What we now know is that our brains change throughout our lives. And if any of you are involved in education, you think, well, I really hope so, because I'm probably wasting my time otherwise. But what it says is that any experiences we have, whatever they might be, will change our brains. And this is illustrated, this is just one illustration. London taxi drivers, I don't know if Madrid taxi drivers have the same kind of issue. London black cab drivers have to carry out an amazing feat of visuospatial memory. They have to learn by heart and know how they're all interconnected, the 20,000 routes within 6 miles of Charing Cross. So the next time you're in London and leap into a black cab, respect to the black cab driver. They do have amazing brains. And what has been shown is that when they carry out this task, and it takes about 3 or 4 years to do, on average, sometimes 6 or more years, and lots of people fail, is that the people who succeed, their brains change quite dramatically as they acquire the knowledge. These particular parts of the brain associated with this kind of visuospatial skill become larger and more active. What's also interesting is that once they retire, those differences disappear. So this is a really nice illustration of how our brains wax and wane with the experiences we have. And there's all sorts of other illustrations, learning to play musical instruments, to speak other languages, to acquire different skills, sports, hobbies, etc. All of those will change our brains. And I think that's really important to remember, because it means the experiences we have, which are afforded us by the outside world, or the experiences we don't have, because perhaps the outside world thinks that's not the kind of thing somebody like you does, that won't change our brains. So we're starting to find a brain difference because of the experiences those brains have had. The other thing is that our brains, the picture we've always had of brains, are pretty much vacuum-packed. Amazing information processing systems, but pretty impermeable to what else was going on. Give them a problem, they would solve it. These kind of studies demonstrate that actually brains solve a problem, but are sensitive to the context, the instructions, the expectations that go with that problem. And this is just an illustration of a social psychology process called stereotype threat, whereas if you tell somebody, this is the kind of task that you're not very good at, but I'd like to see what happens, or this is the kind of task that people like you do really well at, I'd like to see what happens, and you put them in the scanner and give them that task, what you find is that the kind of errors they make reflect the instructions. So we have a behavioral change, so people with the positive message make the fewest mistakes, people with the negative message, surprise, surprise, make the most mistakes. But what's interesting is that that's also reflected at the brain level. So I don't know if you can see that, but there are tiny differences. So this is the brain activity patterns of people who were given a positive message. And what happened was that the areas appropriate to the task, which was in fact one of those spatial tasks, which I'll come back to, those were the areas that activated, and the people carrying out that task did better. Whereas exactly the same task given to another group of people with a different message, the areas of the brain activated there were much more the areas of the brain associated with spotting mistakes or emotional control centers, being really anxious about not making a mistake. So the brain, given the same information, is also aware of the expectations and the attitudes that go with it. So we need to move along. Now, you'll be pleased I'm not going to give you a hugely detailed anatomical discussion. But I think what we need to say is that looking at the brain today in the 21st century, the focus has always been on the fact that the frontal parts of the brain, newest parts of the brain in the human brain, clearly those areas which evolved most recently, largest proportionally in the human brain, must be associated in some way with the success of the human race. Focus was always on the fact that we have language, we can solve problems, we have cool information processing, Sherlock Holmes type skills. We're also great scientists, artists, musicians, we have a sense of humor, etc. So the focus was on the cognitive profiles. But what we now know is that actually a lot of the success of the human race is to do with the fact that we're social, that we collaborate, we solve problems collaboratively. We have many more social networks than any other species, and the size of our social networks are bigger. We're not just individuals moving through the world, we're aware of other people. We have a sense of self, who we are, how we fit into this world. A sense of other people, how do they relate to me, how should I relate to them? A sense of belonging, as we'll see, very powerful. We really need to feel we belong to a group somewhere. We understand social norms. How do people like me normally behave? How do people like you? Should you behave? We understand overall the kind of social scripts which determine conversation, polite social behavior, etc. And we are also fully aware of social stereotypes because they are very useful shortcuts. If you're a newly qualified teacher standing in front of a group of 30 children who are 5 years old, you might like to think, oh, I know, the boys will be like that and the girls will be like that. Instantly, you're into stereotypes. And all of these sort of behaviors, just like any other behavior, are colored by our emotions. We like to think we've evolved beyond control of basic emotions, but actually everything we do is coded. That was a good thing to do. I should do that again. If it was good, and if it was bad, that wasn't a very good thing to do. I don't think that that was the right way to solve that problem. I don't think you're likely to fit into that kind of social group, for example. So cognitive and social norms are being controlled by our emotions. And we have a particular system in the brain, and this is where I've spent most of my neuroimaging years, which I've depicted here as a kind of traffic light system or railway point system. This kind of system here will control, inhibit, limit the kind of behaviors that your brain drives you to produce. Because it will say, you made a mistake there, that wasn't very good, I'm going to help you avoid these kind of issues. Could be something cognitive, but it could also be something social. And I will just briefly again go on to show that being social, feeling that you belong somewhere is very, very important in the human race. And social cognitive neuroscientists like me are really quite unpleasant. We set up all these amazing tasks to see if we can really lower people's self-esteem. We put them in the scanner, we give them awful tasks, we let them accidentally overhear conversations about a list of characteristics, their own characteristics that they listed earlier for an interview, etc. We can get them playing little video games so that you lie in the scanner, two little cartoon characters throwing the ball to each other, then you pop up as another cartoon character, they start throwing the ball to you, and you're all having a good time, and then all of a sudden they stop throwing the ball to you and they just throw it to each other. And I've actually done this task, and I lie there thinking this is just a video game, but actually I'm getting really miffed about the fact that they won't play with me as well. So we're trying to induce a form of social rejection. There's all sorts of other tasks we do to dent people's self-esteem. We get them to think about a really awful mistake they made and how much it was their fault. So we really get them indulging in self-criticism. Think about your workplace. Where are you in the pecking order? Are you pretty low down? Are there other people clearly doing better than you? And all of these areas that are activated are that sort of traffic light, railway points inhibitory system that I showed you earlier. The kind of behavioural measure we can take is to show that this is really reducing people's self-esteem. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because it really illustrates how important being social is, that your social esteem is high, that you have a good sense of belonging. And what's interesting, as from a neuroscience perspective, is that the areas of the brain which are activated when your self-esteem is dented in some way or you're feeling rejected are exactly the same areas that are activated when you suffer real pain. So this is an area where the brain is really primed to say, if anything you confront lowers your self-esteem, then you should really avoid it. The brain, this is a really important driver in the brain. And in fact, if you think about some of the kind of worst psychopathological disorders with the highest forms of mortality, such as depression and eating disorders, these are all linked to problems of self-esteem. So being a sense of belonging, a high level of self-esteem, is actually as important a driver in human behavior, we now know, as making sure that you're not hungry or thirsty, or that your species will be reproduced, or that you need to run away because something dangerous is about to happen. So what we really need to say, and this is the final part of this argument is, or this bit of the jigsaw, is the fact that this all starts very, very early. We always used to think of, this is some work from my lab, so we always used to think of tiny babies as helpless, rather even described as subcortical, because the human baby is dependent and helpless for the longest of the young of any other species. So we assume that human babies aren't good at much, other than crying and excreting and keeping people awake at night. But actually the human baby is an amazing piece of social radar. And right from the beginning, right from the moment of birth, possibly before even, human babies are tuned to pick up the social codes in their outside world. The faces are more important than scrambled images, that a particular kind of language is the language going to be the language of your carer and not a different language. So very, very tiny babies can distinguish between Spanish and Dutch and English and Italian, etc. In amazing kind of experiments, which I'd love to tell you about, but another time. But in fact, and also the one thing we do know is that what they're looking for is differences, important things in their outside world. They very quickly pick up on the fact that gender is a very important clue. And we can see from their behavior as they get older how they spot the differences. Different people do different things. They start to want to know. I call them junior gender detectives, so they get these tiny social sponges becoming junior gender detectives. They're quickly looking to say, I'm a boy, what do boys do? She's a girl, what do girls do? And working out the rules of society. So the social brains are developing, in fact, much faster than the cognitive brains. So all of this means that I should be looking, really saying, we've always focused on what's going on inside the world in terms of inside the brain in terms of understanding how brains get to be different. But if we now look at what 21st century neuroscience has to show us in terms of our plastic brains, how they respond to experiences, our permeable brains, they're sensitive to attitudes, our social brains, they really, really want to pick out the rules of society. This instantly means that what's going on in the world is very important for us brain scientists and for anybody who wants to know how brains get to be different. We should be looking at that outside world. So, do we think that the outside world is in any way gendered? Do we think that we treat men and women the same, that we treat boys and girls the same? Well, as you could probably tell from the tone of my voice, I'm feeling that actually we do live in a very gendered world. And if any of you wanted to just muse quietly about the last time you went to a toy shop, or even if you're walking down the aisles of a supermarket, my family get very anxious when I go into a supermarket because I start raging up and down the aisles saying, oh, they've even gendered the shower gel. So our world does treat our brains differently, and we now know that will change the brain. So let's have a quick look and see at the kind of differences we might be talking about. So, do we treat boy babies different from girl babies? And I don't know if gender reveal parties have reached Spain at all. Nods, I heard of gender reveal parties. This is the notion that 20 weeks before a human being even arrives in the world, there is some sort of coding going on about whether they're going to be male or female. Gender reveal parties, 20 weeks into a pregnancy, you can have a scan, pretty reliably predict whether or not the child is going to be a boy or a girl. queue for an amazing party with awful invitations like, is it going to be rifles or is it going to be ruffles? For example, I'm not sure how well that would translate into Spanish, but you get from the tone of my voice, they are very extreme parties. You go to the party, there's a big cake which you cut open, and if it's got blue frosting in, it's going to be a boy, and if it's pink frosting, it's going to be a girl. Big box full of balloons, knock the top off. Hey, it's blue balloons. Hey, it's pink balloons, etc. Or you get cakes like this, which are engraved with touchdown or tutus. Talk about coding for gender. Even the cakes are gendered. And I even found something quite recently, which I will share with you, which you might regret. And that's you can get a gender reveal lasagna. So you can invite your family to your gender reveal party and you can serve them lasagna where the cheese sauce is dyed either pink or blue. Which I think you'll agree looks pretty disgusting. Anyway, so moving on, because you're getting the message, I'm sure, that boys and girl babies are treated differently. So you get those, I'm hoping the audience isn't full of card manufacturers, those awful, it's a baby girl pink cards, it's a baby boy blue cards, and I have in other fora described the pink or blue tsunami that washes over tiny human beings when they arrive. And you've only got to go into a maternity ward and there's pink balloons and blue cards or pink teddy bears or blue teddy bears. Even the maternity wards will code the children differently. And we get different kinds of clothes that they wear. And you also get, for example, the beautiful girls' colouring book or the brilliant boys' colouring book. And there is a big movement in the UK, which may also be in Spain, looking at toys in particular. It's called Let Toys Be Toys, because there is a feeling that toys are a very powerful signal to children very early on that there are different things that are available to them. There are boys' toys and there are girls' toys. And boys' toys tend to be construction, Power Ranger, superhero type dressing up clothes, whereas girls' clothes, toys, obviously coded pink, are to do with being a princess or playing with dolls, or not necessarily very creative. So society does treat boys and girls differently. Now, does this matter? Well, if you remember, I talked before about the way in which experiences can change the brain. And this is a very nice illustration of how something that's going on in the world will produce what looks like a sex difference. And it becomes very well entrenched in the at last the truth, proof at last type argument. And that is the idea, and this comes way back to the kind of men being map readers as opposed to the multitasking women. These kind of tasks, this is a mental rotation test where you have to imagine this two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional figure. And the question is, are these two figures the same except for their orientation? So you have to image that set of cubes there, mentally rotate it in your head and say, is that one the same, or is it different, or is one part of it sticking out in a different orientation? I won't give you the answer because I'm afraid stereotypically I'm really bad at this task, but I am very good at parallel parking, which is another supposedly reliable male-female differentiator, although I'll never be able to do that again because everybody will be watching and waiting for me to crash. Big study done in the survey in the States saying, okay, well, let's have a look at this spatial cognition task. And it is important because it's the kind of skill which is claimed to underpin, for example, why there is such an underrepresentation of women in science. And that is another campaign of mine, which you will meet again later. And the idea is that there is some kind of innate skill, this spatial cognition skill, which makes men better scientists, and doing surveys and showing that men, on average, remembering our overlapping data, generally do better on these sort of tasks. And that, of course, has implications for all sorts of diversity initiatives or encouraging girls into science, etc. But remember that our brains respond to the experiences we've had. Remember also that I've suggested that toys may well have different kind of training opportunities, offer different kind of training opportunities to those who play with them. And if you look at the kind of toys that boys play with, and this has been well categorized, you'll see that they actually, this is a wonderful Lego diagram, which if you think is pretty similar to that. If any of you have made Lego, you get these really complicated instructions, which are actually very difficult to follow, but then they also involve, now you've made the base of the car, you have to turn it upside down to put the axles on, etc. So a very good training opportunity for the kind of people who play with Lego. Similarly, video games. Video games like Super Mario are really, really good for spatial training. I give talks in schools, and I can see the teachers at the back rolling their eyes when I tell the children, video games are really good for you. But there is a powerful message there that these are kind of opportunities which are given to some of our community and not everybody. Is that true? Am I really being unkind? Well, I think if we have a look at the kind of similar sort of toys that are given to girls, this is Lego Friends. So yes, girls do play with Lego, but their kind of Lego is slightly different. It's not complicated construction, bigger bricks, because girls clearly aren't good at those kind of fine manipulation things. What can they make? They can make hairdressing salons, for example. Just a whiff of a stereotype there, perhaps. But this is my favorite. This is STEM Barbie the engineer. Now, Mattel is going to solve the problem of the underrepresentation of women in science by producing Barbie the engineer. So we have Barbie in a very, very short lab coat, even shorter miniskirt. It has got DNA patterns on to make it sciencey, holding a microscope to show she's sciencey, alarmingly high heels, clearly never been in a lab, but safety glasses to show she's a scientist. So what is it that STEM Barbie can do, or Barbie the engineer? She can make a pink washing machine or a pink jewelry carousel. And I think there's also a table for cutting out dress patterns. So again, whiff of a stereotype perhaps going there. So really what I'm saying is that toys are important. The fact that people give boys different toys from girls could well have downstream consequences. Interestingly, when the people who found that difference between males and females in these kind of tasks, and there was a big array of tasks, when they actually took spatial experience into account, what kind of toys did you play with as a child? What kind of hobbies have you got? What kind of sports do you play? What kind of occupation are you in? They got themselves a spatial experience score. When they factored that into the data, the sex difference disappeared altogether. So effectively, what looked like a sex difference was something to do with experience. So moving on. Again, we know that attitudes and expectations change the brain. If we look at education, for example, especially in the early years, you can see quite profound evidence of gender stereotyping within the classrooms of very young children. There was a BBC documentary, No More Boys and Girls, which actually went into a class of 7-year-olds, had a look at all the stereotype material within the classroom, the fact that boys and girls lined up separately, they put their coats in different coloured cupboards, pink and blue, you've guessed. The teacher called the girls Sweet Pea and the boys Mate. So this camera crew then followed those children for 6 weeks, having taken out all of the gender stereotyping they could think of, encouraged them to play sports together, made sure they played the same sort of games which gave them the same sort of experiences, and had actually quite a marked difference on those children. I was part of that, and one of the things that struck me was these were 7-year-olds. Before anything started, they were given different measures of self-esteem and confidence, etc. And they were asked, how well would you do on this kind of game, on a scale of 1 to 10? And the girls were almost universally down at 3 or 4. Well, I'm not very good at that kind of thing. I probably wouldn't be able to do that. Whereas the boys were up at 9 and 10 and 11 if it was a possibility. So these were 7-year-olds. But of course, they've been living in a gendered world for 7 years, and they've been spotting the differences possibly for at least 4 or 5 of those years. So 7-year-olds are very much gendered, and their brains will reflect that too. And there's all sorts of other things in the educational field that we should worry about, that teachers seem to overmark boys, in particular science subjects, and undermark girls. 6-year-olds given a choice between a game for a really, really clever person or a person who works really, really hard. The 6-year-old girls almost universally never chose the game for really, really clever people, because 6-year-old girls aren't really, really clever, because girls aren't clever, are they? Or similarly, 9-year-old girls thinking that maths is a boy thing. Well, I think we're nearing the end of my time, and this is just really, again, to say, and this is where I reintroduce my other campaign about the underrepresentation of women in science. A lot of explanations are to do with biology. Actually, they're not suited for science. This was certainly the claims early on. One of the greatest scientists of all time. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than women can, brackets, ever attain. So this was Charles Darwin, who had a very clear view about the evolutionary scales that he was looking at. Women were inferior. Now you could say, okay, 200 years ago, we've moved on, haven't we? But then you look at the statements of male, I'm afraid, scientists talking about whether or not women could or should do science. Larry Summers, president of Harvard, saying there was certainly unlikely to be highly successful women engineers and mathematicians because of a lack of aptitude. Writer of the Google memo saying Google was wasting its time on diversity initiatives because men and women, partly, kindly, due to biological causes, can't do Google sort of work. And then just recently, Alexandra Strumier, a physicist in Stern, stood up and said physics shouldn't be wasting its time on educating or encouraging girls to do physics because biologically they really were incapable. So you could say there is a particular attitude, and bearing in mind that we are social beings, girls who are clearly cognitively capable, because the performance levels are always very much the same, may be approaching that particular culture and their brain is sort of signaling, do a U-turn when necessary. This really is not for you. So that's something that we should think about. Do we blame the individual brain, or do we say, is that brain looking carefully at that culture, and is that culture should that culture be looking at itself if it's actually turning people away? So just the final 2 slides then. Remember, this is where we started. We thought that there was some kind of essentialist, biologically determined pathway where there were male brains and female brains, which were the result of a biological script playing out inevitably in the world. My line is that actually we should be looking much more at what's going on in that world. It's a biological script, yes, but it's playing out on a social stage. And having spent a long time showing you quite complicated brain imaging diagrams, I feel a 6-year-old has summed this up wonderfully. We need to bear in mind, if we want to understand how brains get to be different, that everybody's brain is attached to the world. So the take-home message, brains reflect the lives they have lived, not just the sex of their owners, and a gendered world produces a gendered brain. Thank you very much.